Hey there. I chose a painting for this project found on page 324, and it's titled The Judgment of Paris, and it was painted by a 17th century painter, Claude Lorrain, and it was painted in 1645. You can find it on page 324. I'm going to show you a picture here, but for this activity, the picture doesn't do it justice. So when you look it up online, you can get a much bigger, brighter picture than the one that's in our textbook. But The Judgment of Paris was done in an oil painting on canvas, and the subject content of the painting is essentially the mythological story of Paris, who was chosen by the gods to pick the most beautiful woman out of a group of three goddesses. And essentially who he chose was Aphrodite. Some of the aspects of the painting are that Lorrain uses both hard and soft lines. So he uses these lines towards the edge that really create a border and kind of draw you back into the center of the piece. He used mostly warm colors. He only used cool colors for one tree, specifically at the top towards the horizon, and for Aphrodite's clothing. He used a good balance. So you have several smaller figures that are clustered in the bottom left-hand corner of the painting. And what he did to balance out the rest of the landscape is that he used this great expanse in your top right. So a lot of clouds, some skyline, didn't put a whole lot in the top right or in the bottom right. So everything's predominantly in the left-hand bottom of the canvas. So when we talk about kind of the elements that the artist used, he used a good mix of linear perspective. So he was trying to give the illusion of depth because the scenery takes place in a valley, specifically on the upper part of the valley. So you're towards the top and then you're looking down. So he wanted to have some depth, not only in your landscape, but also so that you could show that there was atmospheric perspective. So when we talk about the skyline and the shadows on the ground, when we talk about the skyline, what he did was he used kind of some soft faded colors, and in the bottom of the canvas he used shadows. So the shadows, even though we think of shadows and we immediately think it's dark, what he did was he had a soft, warm, dusky color on the bottom to kind of give the sense that it was a tranquil and very peaceful kind of afternoon, not so much dark in terms of the sun's going down and night's about to fall. Lorrain also used one of the elements called implied light around the edges of the canvas. So with the implied light, what he was doing was essentially giving you a full scope of what that afternoon looked like from top to bottom, but with the implied light around the edges, he's drawing you back to the central focus of the piece, which was Paris and the three goddesses, and he had to choose between the three. And you see him relaxing, sitting on a stone, and he's gazing at these women, and they're enjoying it, essentially, and they're vying for his attention on this hillside. When we talk about the colors of the painting, Lorrain used warm colors, but he used warm colors not so much dark, like he used warm reds. I guess that's the same thing, but his reds were kind of muted so that it wasn't so aggressive and so in your face. He used a subtlety for the animals in the bottom of the landscape so that they didn't really stand out. The only colors that you see are in the horizon, in your treetop, and only in the clothing that Aphrodite's wearing. She has on a blue garment, and that's really the only really true pop of color that you see in the entire piece. So if I had to interpret this painting, the assignment asked for us to give a sentence, but for me it came down to a word, and that one word was infatuation. Because when you're looking at the painting, Aphrodite is absolutely owning it, the entire thing. And so when Lorraine painted Paris, trying to choose between the three women, what he did was, of the three women, Aphrodite is the only one who's fully clothed. The rest of the women have no clothing on whatsoever, and he painted them very pale, very stark, very unattractive. But Aphrodite is the only figure, including Paris, who's fully clothed, who's radiant, who's exuding an inner beauty that belies what the naked human form looks like. He wanted, my interpretation is that Lorraine wanted to focus so much on Aphrodite that not only did he paint her as the most beautiful figure, but he completely muted the landscape around her so that there was nothing in nature that could take away from how beautiful she was. So when I first found this piece, I only liked certain parts of it. I didn't, at first glance, like the landscape. I didn't think that it did justice to what the center of the painting was. The center of the painting was what I enjoyed. But the more that I started critiquing and trying to determine the elements and some of the things that we had learned in chapters 3 and 4, what I found was that number one, I was judging it based on an emotional relation. So who wouldn't want to, for a woman, who wouldn't see that kind of emotional, romantic piece of it and not be a little touched, right? The second thing was, when I judged it, I was judging it on how he captured, essentially realistically, how he captured not only the individuals, the figures that we see, right down to the gestures and the mannerisms, because every figure is doing something different. He had a detail in the extremities that made it seem more realistic, but at the same time, when he was capturing the animals, he did so that he got just the form of the animal, not necessarily all of the detail of the animal itself. And I saw the contrast between the two, and I liked it. So then I looked at the formal elements, and the more that I spent with this painting, the more I realized that in the landscape, Lorraine had focused so much on making the figures in the middle of the painting the sole focal point for it, that he had these little hidden treasures in the landscape. So you spend so much time looking at Aphrodite, and you look at Paris, and you look at the other people that weren't chosen, that you miss these things, like there's a cave hidden in the background, and there's a running waterfall in your top left-hand corner. And as you gaze down into the valley, you see this body of water that looks like a lake, and there's mountains in the distance, and those are the things that you really overlook because you're so focused on Aphrodite and Paris in the middle of the piece. And that, when I was trying to judge it based on my emotions, by the end of it, it was really his technique and his formal elements that I enjoyed the most, because he was trying so hard to prove Aphrodite's beauty, and he did that, but he also remembered to catch the other aspects and the other things that are beautiful in nature itself. So, if you have the opportunity, take a look at Claude Lorraine's Judgment in Paris.